Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of daily life in the 18th century. I'm Davia Brown, and I'm joined by Ron Carnegie.
Good afternoon.
He interprets President George Washington here at Colonial Williamsburg, and today we're going to be talking about inaugurations, and in particular, the first three inaugurations that Washington is involved in. Ron, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. I've been an employee here at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for just over 25 years. I've been portraying George Washington for, I think, 15 of those 25 years. And I'm looking forward to discussing our first three inaugurations with you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ron. We are looking forward to answering your questions during this live stream, so please put them in the comments and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. To get the conversation started, Ron, would you tell us a bit more about that first inauguration, which did not take place in Washington, D.C.? Surprise, surprise to those of you who did not know that.
Certainly. The first inauguration was actually in New York, which was serving as the capital at the time. Washington, when the election was confirmed by the Congress and the House, was at his home in Virginia, at Mount Vernon. The Secretary of the Congress rode with the information that he had been chosen and had won that election. And then immediately, the very next day, he began his trip so he could get there as soon as possible to not keep the Congress and the Senate waiting. And that he was going to fail. Ever since the conclusion of the war, it had become customary for poor Washington that whenever he traveled anywhere on any sort of official trip and people knew he was traveling, they would stop him and often meet him outside the city, often with a white horse, and expect him to ride in on that horse, escorted by an honor guard. There'd often be various celebrations when he got into the city, balls and speeches given and return speeches said. Washington appreciated the gratitude that people showed him for the war, but it also was very frustrating to him. He considered travel to be a waste of time, and he tried always to get to his destinations as soon as he could so he could get to the business at hand. And in this case, there was also the combined Congress waiting for him.
So when he finally does make it to New York, what was that inauguration day like?
It was quite a big celebration, a lot of pomp and circumstance. He was met at the President's house on Cherry Street by 8 members, combined committee of the Senate and the House. These 8 were all veterans themselves, veterans of the American Revolution. He was escorted into a state carriage with 4 horses to be driven to the Federal Hall. The Federal Hall was a building on the corner of Broadway and Wall. There's a building still on that site today. And that was where the inauguration was going to take place. That's where the Congress was meeting. And he was escorted by dragoons through streets lined with people cheering and glad to see the president, the hero of the revolution. He, for the opportunity, was dressed in a brown wool suit that had been made, woven from American fabric, and sewn in America, a completely American-made suit, is that symbol of building American manufacturing. When he got to the Federal Hall, he entered the building, he met with the Congress and the Senate, he met and addressed his new vice president, and then when the time was ready, he stepped out onto the balcony and there received the oath of office as the President of the United States, taken on a Bible belonging to the St. John's Masonic Lodge up in New York. And when the oath was given, he may or may not have, depending on the sources, have said, "So help me God," and then kissed the Bible, then returned into the building to give an inaugural address, which was mostly talking about him in his past, his gratitude for the position, and his hopes for how the matter would unfold and how he intended to do the job of the presidency. Then they left from there, and the bodies together attended a church service.
So that was the first inauguration, and we actually want to kind of dive a bit more into the swearing-in process and the oath. Our first audience question is from Amy. She wants to know, was the oath the same as the one that was used today?
It was mostly the same, Amy, except that the words I mentioned that he may or may not have said, some sources said he did, some sources say he did not, but the "so help me God," that has been added. It was added to the oath at a later date, so it is a part of that oath now. But the oath is laid out, besides that, in the Constitution, and I think it's there on the screen for you to see right now. Right now.
Yeah, I see it. Yep. So that is the oath that was used for inauguration today, and that was pretty similar to what Washington used in the first inauguration swearing-in process. So a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of celebration. What was the second inauguration like then? Was it similar?
No, that one was quite a bit different. During Washington's first term of office, we see an introduction of party politics into the United States. I say that. You could argue there was party politics with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists about whether the Constitution should be adopted earlier. But now you have what's more fledgling parties, and that starts with Thomas Jefferson's party, the Republican Party, not the modern version of it, but his version. And one of their complaints was they thought the administration was being too monarchist and too aristocratic. And so recognizing that and trying not to offend and trying not to give strength to the Republican Party, Washington steps back from a lot of that ceremony. And at the second inauguration, he goes on his own, not in a state carriage, but in his own carriage, with a whole lot less fanfare and recognition. And then the actual inaugural event was done just with him and the Congress and the Senate as a private ceremony, indoors, not on the balconies.
So first one, more pomp and circumstance and celebration. Second one, a little bit more solemn and subdued. The third inauguration is actually when Washington steps out of the presidency and John Adams takes over as his successor. What was that inauguration like?
More like the first, but not quite as large. I should probably mention, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, the second inauguration and the third are both in Philadelphia. The capital moved from New York to Philadelphia with the understanding that it was going to then eventually move to a new federal city, what Washington always called the national city, which we, of course, today refer to by his name, Washington, D.C. And it wasn't quite as large as that first one was, but it was still much bigger than the second one. Adams wore a beautiful white suit. He had a sword at his side. You can imagine Adams with a sword. And when he got there, he was surprised to find that Washington was already there. Washington had come just dressed in a black suit. He'd slipped in through the side. He walked to that inauguration, which I think is part of the symbolism that he's after with what's happening, because that's what's really important there. In a way, I would argue the third inauguration is much more important than the second one. Maybe not more than the first, but it's still in its fashion more, because it began a custom that we have followed for 245 years, a custom that we have continued even today, and that is that peaceful transition of power. That's something I think as Americans we often take for granted. You'll often read that one of the greatest things Washington did was step away from power, which he did twice. He did it when he resigned his commission at the end of the American Revolution. He did it again when he steps away from the presidency. But what we often as Americans fail to recognize is that our presidents always do that. They always step away from the power and it transitions to their successor. And that still is not a universal truism across the world. It's an unusual circumstance. And we have seen it in every one of our alterations, our changes from one president to another.
And hopefully that is the thing that continues, that from the beginning to now, that's very powerful to think about, that's how we know things are working the way that they're intended to, when you have that peaceful transfer. We're getting some great questions from the audience. Please continue to send those in. We have a question from John. He wants to know, which Bible did Washington use? I think which version of the Bible when he was sworn in.
If I understand what you mean by the question, it was a King James Bible. It still survives today. It still belongs to the St. John's Masonic Masonic Lodge up in New York, though it's often on display at the Federal Hall. And it's probably worth mentioning that he's not the only president to have taken his oath of office on that Bible. Presidents decide what Bible or what book they will use for their inauguration. And a number, I can't share with you the names, but you can easily find it online. A number of presidents have used that same Bible.
I think it's good to mention whatever book because Jefferson ends up using a Quran when he is sworn in.
And it's been used by others, as I understand, at least one other.
Yes. Jamie wants to know, what do you, Ron, think Washington would think of the festivities that take place today during inaugurations?
In some ways, they're very similar. I mean, not this year because of the pandemic and things like that, where a lot of it is more subdued. But we still frequently have balls. They had balls and assemblies. I didn't mention that, but after Washington's, I mentioned the church service, but that evening they had fireworks. That sounds pretty modern, doesn't it? They had fireworks. They had illuminations. That is a common 18th century celebration. We still do it here at Colonial Williamsburg for Christmas, but in the period it used to be done for a number of large celebrations. And that's when they would put fires in cressets, those are like bonfires on a pole, candles in the windows, and light up the town. And that was done for Washington's inauguration. But there were balls and assemblies just like we still do in a normal, healthy year.
Yes. Normal, healthy year, that'd be nice. Doug wants to know, with the rise of the political parties that ended up happening post first inauguration going into the second, was there any public unrest centered around the following inaugurations?
That's one thing I could mention when we talk about that third inauguration, which I didn't. I wouldn't say there was a lot of public unrest at the inauguration, but that was the first time our system unfolded the way it was actually intended. In the previous two elections, the one that Washington won, he won those with a unanimous vote. But when his second term was coming to an end, he had announced that he wasn't going to stand for a third term. He had printed his farewell address that he was leaving the office, and therefore it was more contentious because somebody else was going to win and they were going to have to fight to win. And that ends up happening. We end up with a very negative campaign between Adams and Jefferson. Very similar to a modern campaign. They were slinging mud. They were saying horrible things about each other. And that's going to put for a somewhat awkward situation because in those days, the man that wins the most votes is the president, and the man that comes in second is his vice president. So Thomas Jefferson ends up being vice president to John Adams. So you can imagine some of the difficulty that's going to charge or cause. Beyond that, I wouldn't say that the first three inaugurations, except for that political aspect of that, we've had some others that were more challenging later. And we've had some actions taken by presidents in their lame duck period, too. In fact, the inaugurations in the period, as per the original Constitution, inaugurations used to be on the 4th of March. And they were moved up to the present date to reduce the amount of time that a president is in office after knowing that his term is up.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of his term, Teresa wants to know, why did Washington serve 8 years when he could have served for life?
He certainly could have. He certainly could have. In fact, a lot of men, even some of his political enemies like Thomas Jefferson, thought that Washington was going to serve for life. And they didn't have a difficulty with it. They assumed that was true. Some people, including John Adams, actually accused Washington of stepping down because he didn't think he would win a third term. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think he would have been unanimously chosen for a third term, because of that rise of political parties and the people who had turned against him. But I still think he would have won. But Washington never wanted the office in the first place. He served reluctantly. He tried to get out of serving the position. He was hoping, his plan when he accepted was that he would only serve temporarily. He didn't even want to finish his first term. And in fact, he intended, we mentioned the farewell addresses. He wrote a farewell address that he intended to make public. Well, he had Madison write it. Washington always felt that he suffered a deficiency of education, as he put it. So he surrounds himself by better writers and better penmen. And so he actually has Madison write that first farewell address and intended to make it public and to not run for a second term. But remember, we keep talking these political factions? Two of the driving forces of those factions, his Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Hamilton, and his Secretary of the State, Mr. Jefferson, both came to him, and they realized the danger they had unleashed with their political factions. They knew that the nation was at risk of being torn asunder. They insisted that he stand for a second term. And in the end, that's what he did and why.
I think that's a very powerful thing to think about too, the fact that he did not want to be in this position to begin with, which might be what made him such a good leader, because he knew, maybe had that foresight of how power could lead to
Absolutely.
even more greater destruction. And with that foresight, what was his vision for foreign affairs? Since he's setting this precedent as the first president, what is he thinking going forward?
Well, we have the advantage. I've mentioned a few times now the farewell address, and that's exactly what it is. The farewell address basically lays out what he thinks the nation should do in the future. It also, it's a little defensive. Part of it, the part we don't talk about as much, is where he's showing why he did what he did and how that meets the maxim. So in some ways, it's him explaining why he did what he did as well. But he, one of the things he points out very clearly, and he begins a policy that we will follow at least in Europe. I don't know that we followed it as well on this hemisphere, but on the other side of the world, we entered into a policy of isolationism. And that was because it was something Washington argued for in the farewell address. I don't know that he really meant it as long-term as we ended up following it, because our nation, we had just barely got our keel afloat and fixed financial issues and difficulties that the war had brought on us. So I'm not sure if he really did mean forever. But he mentions that we should avoid being entangled in foreign embroilments, and a lot of it are embroiled in foreign entanglements. And a lot of what he's doing is referring to his neutrality compact and his decision on how to deal with France and with England in a war that was ravaging Europe at the time.
Amy wants to know, did Washington have a lot of involvement in planning the inauguration, or was he more of a participant?
I would argue mostly he was more of a participant, particularly the second one, where he leaves it over to the members of the Congress and his staff. Actually, his cabinet does a lot of that. Again, I think part of that was that political aspect we talked about earlier, and to the rise of opinion. But a lot of that is going to be driven by them.
And then going back into how Washington did not want to be president to begin with, Kevin wants to know if there's any insight into how Martha, his wife, thought about Washington becoming president.
There is. And this is partly Washington's fault. Washington is creating precedences left and right. He's concerned that he may offend people. He's very, very careful whenever he does anything, and he thinks it all through in advance. Now, that's one of the advantages of him being the first president, but what a lot of people don't recognize is that's how Washington had been living his life for a long time. Part of that is because of his insecurities, but he was constantly thinking about his actions and how they might be perceived or what they might cause. And one of the things that ends up doing, unfortunately for Martha Washington, is it limits her freedom. They end up putting strong restrictions, and by they I mean Washington's staff and his cabinet, and to some degrees Washington himself. They create restrictions of where she can visit and who can she visit and when, because they don't want to accidentally offend somebody. They don't want to find that the president's wife is visiting this family more than this family or avoiding this family. And Martha will later write, and it's partly because of this, that she felt like she was living in a political prison. When Washington retired and returned to Mount Vernon, he was pleased. But I think his wife was just as pleased, if not more so.
It often makes me wonder if, being president at any time period in this country's history, how difficult it must be for the spouses and families of these leaders, because they're in such a position where everyone's eyes are on them, constantly analyzing and commenting. And by association, that extends to the families. I think it makes sense how many spouses of former presidents, including some of our most recent, have been glad that they couldn't run for a third election.
Some of that has increased over time, and I think with that in mind, I think Dolly Madison deserves some attention, because the whole concept of what we now have of what a first lady is, even that term, first lady, was created for her and for the way she did her job, where she learned how to use the position to support her husband and to support the politics. I don't mean to say that Martha Washington didn't do that, but not to the same degree in the same fashion. In fact, I'll give an example of Martha Washington doing it. Washington had this horrible idea for levees. That was the official way you met Washington. And a levee is an ancient custom. It is very, very aristocratic. And he'd come out in this velvet suit with this sword, and nobody was comfortable there. The people attending and coming to them weren't comfortable. He wasn't comfortable, and they weren't very successful because of that. Martha started a policy of tea salons that weren't the president's at all. They were the president's wife, and they were entirely sociable events, and those end up being far more effective than the levees ever were.
Well, kind of as a follow-up, Beth wants to know, did Martha attend the inaugurations for Washington, or did anyone else in his family or household?
Martha did not. Martha and some other family members and a number of their enslaved people will arrive later to set up the house on Cherry Street. So they're not there at the actual inauguration. I think part of that was because of the timing. Washington leaves the very next day after the secretary arrives to tell them that he's taken the position. There's not a lot of time to plan. There's not a lot of time to prepare. And it's difficult to know who actually traveled with him on that first trip. There's not a lot of documentation on it. We know that he traveled with Charles Thompson, the Secretary of the Congress. We know that he brought Daniel Humphrey, who was his sort of acting as a secretary, and he was there to biography Washington, a biography that ends up never being printed, oddly enough. And I suspect he's also traveling with his valet, his personal servant. Men rarely travel without their personal servants in the period. And that man at the time was a very young, enslaved man by the name of Christopher Shields.
Juliana, who is 10 years old, wants to know, how did Washington help to form a national unity, especially considering how much of the continent had been explored and discovered at that time?
That's a very good question, and that's actually the importance of Washington, and it's why he's there. It's why he ends up taking the position. Washington's changed by the war. And I would argue he's one of our first real Americans. Most people living in what we call the United States today, at the period we're talking about, even after the adoption of the Constitution, are more likely to refer to themselves as Massachusetts men or Virginians or Yorkers than they are to refer to themselves as Americans. Washington becomes an American because of his service in the war, because of what he sees in the war and how he sees regionality differences being more of a problem. I don't mean having the differences. I mean being more concerned about your region than the larger nation. He sees a bigger country than a lot of these people really do. And so because of that, because of issues that are happening under the previous system of government, under the Articles of Confederation, he becomes a big supporter of a stronger federal government and the creation of a new system of government, our American Constitution. When that convention meets in Philadelphia, he'll end up being made the president of that body, the chairman of the organization that's creating it. That's how president used to be used, was as a chairman of a committee. And that's what he's doing. He's presiding over the committee of the body that creates our Constitution. And the reason he ends up having to take that position when he doesn't want it is because of that, because he is viewed as a unifying source.
Right.
Washington is in a strange position. Washington is probably our oldest political icon. He is a symbol of our nation before the eagle is. And while he's still walking on the earth and as a man, it must have been an uncomfortable situation, I think, for him, particularly with his humility. But it was how he ends up having this important role to bring the nation together. He was the most unifying portion of our nation. That's exactly the argument that was being made by Hamilton and Jefferson when they asked him to remain in office.
Right. Considering how large and diverse America is today, it's definitely good to want to start off by being unified. Just imagine being disunified today.
I do not doubt that Washington would remind us that as important as our union was during the Revolution, it's still where our strength and our importance depends.
Agreed. Natalie wants to know, why was Mr. President chosen as a manner of address versus other titles?
A number of reasons. There was some debate over that. The Congress actually wanted Your Highness, the President of the United States, and something else. There were some other add-on titles. They're very, very much like royalty. I don't know if you've heard king's titles, but they usually have all sorts of additional things, defender of the faith, and various countries that country no longer owns. And similar things were mentioned by the Congress. In the end, they decided for exactly what's in the Constitution, President of the United States. And my understanding is that it was sort of just by how it unfolded, almost by accident, when he was, because the way you actually refer to him in person is usually just Mr. President. And he was addressed that way at the inauguration, and it stuck.
Jennifer wants to know if during his presidency spent in New York and Philadelphia, he had slaves. He did have enslaved people on his plantation, Mount Vernon, here in Virginia. So were any of them taken with him when he went?
They were. When Martha Washington arrived, she brings 6 enslaved people up from Mount Vernon to help run the household. And that'll begin a trend that continues throughout the presidency. Later, after the first term, the government moves to Pennsylvania, and that causes one of the issues in Washington's record. Pennsylvania had passed what they called the Gradual Manumission Act, which stopped slavery in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania slaves were all freed immediately, and slaves visiting Pennsylvania, if they were within the state for more than 6 months, they weren't considered to be visiting anymore. So they would be considered free at that point. And as a stain on Washington's reputation, during his presidency, he was moving slaves back and forth to avoid them meeting that 6-month requirement. And even there, he wasn't always following the law, because sometimes they weren't even leaving the state. They were sometimes just leaving Philadelphia. He has some slaves run away, enslaved people leaving him while he's in Philadelphia. Most famously would be, one of them actually is back home. But there's Hercules, his cook. Hercules actually runs from Mount Vernon. But I suspect that's why he was there. He was working, he had been a cook and allowed almost freedom of Philadelphia. He was very famous, very well known. He was a French-trained chef. And suddenly he's working in the fields back at Mount Vernon. And he's at Mount Vernon when he runs. And the other one is Ona, or Oni Judge, who runs away from the house in Philadelphia. She is discovered where she's run to, but they never do successfully get her back. Hercules disappears. Nobody knows where he went. But Ona Judge they did find and couldn't get her to come back. And Washington wasn't willing to be seen as the President of the United States. With as divisive as that issue had already become, he couldn't allow to be seen having this woman wrenched out of her home and forced against her will back into slavery. So she was allowed, in the end she maintained her freedom. That's a pretty remarkable story on its own right, and very interesting.
It definitely is, and it makes me wonder, had he not been president and she had run, would things have turned out differently?
It's hard to say. There's some reference that Washington went through an evolution on the subject that we're talking about. It's one of the things that happens from him becoming an American and no longer a Virginian, is he starts adopting other areas thinking, he starts thinking more like them, and he starts turning against that institution. We'd know more about that if he wasn't president. He was afraid to do anything publicly because the success of the Union was so important to him that he was afraid to show either support for slavery or against slavery, which really limits his hands on what he can do as the president. In his personal writing, though, it's very clear that he had grown against slavery. The reason he gives for why he's rotating the slaves is because they're not ready for freedom. They're not educated. But he actually does end up educating slaves that he owns, enslaved people that he owns. And in the end of his life, the people that belonged to him, half of the slaves at Mount Vernon, were freed through his will. The other half weren't his. It's also interesting to me that the slaves that were with them in the presidency typically weren't his either, like Ona Judge. They were usually dower slaves, which means they belong to the Custis estate. And I apologize for my wording. The problem with the work I do in being in character is I have a habit of using period terms. We should be referring to these as enslaved people, not slaves. Term slave is the period they used in the period, but this was something that was forced on them and not who they are. It shouldn't define them.
Thank you for adding that clarification, because that's definitely something that across the foundation we want to make sure we're being honest and respectful of the people that we talk about, especially those who were enslaved. Jackson, age 9, wants to know how old Washington was when he became president.
The question is, how old was Washington when he was made president? He was 57. 57 years old.
And then Heather wants to know, is it true that Washington had to borrow money in order to attend his first inauguration?
One of the challenges with being a Virginian in the period, and it's certainly true with Washington, is these men, their wealth is often wrapped up in their property. They often have tremendous amounts of debt. They don't often have a lot of cash. And the war was rough on Washington. Mount Vernon, the 5 farms that make up Mount Vernon, all never did as well after the war as they had done previous to the war, until after the presidency when Washington opens up a distillery. But it's financially in debt when he comes back after the war. He owes a lot of money. To make matters worse, the house becomes, as Washington calls it, a well-resorted tavern. People traveling in the area, as Washington put it, everybody traveling north to south or south to north feels the need to visit his home. And by the rules of hospitality, he has to put them up, and put them up as long as they wish to stay. And this is putting a great hardship on Washington financially. So much so that the legislature of Virginia had considered passing a bill to give Washington a stipend, give him money to help offset the expense of this hospitality, of paying for these visitors. And Washington, when he heard about it, refused it and told them to stop. Washington served throughout the Revolution, saying that he wasn't serving for any personal gain. That's one of the reasons he was reluctant to take the presidency. And he refused to take this money that could have helped him with some of his expenses because of that promise, because he wasn't serving to gain anything. And he needed it, frankly. That same year that happened, the house was only worth, the annual income of the house that year was only £69, which is not really a very large amount of money, even in the period.
We've been getting some great questions in, and if anyone has any more, please send them in the comments. We talked about how Washington did not want to be president. Emma wants to know, is it known why Washington didn't seem to be comfortable at large social events, like maybe his inauguration? Was it a personality? Was he more on the introverted or shy side of things?
I would definitely argue he was more introverted. Part of that is his nature. Part of it is probably insecurity, as I alluded to a little earlier. Washington, the expectation was that Washington was going to attend school, academy in England. His older brothers had done that. His father and his father's father had done that. But his father died when he was 11. And his mother was of the opinion they didn't have enough money to afford that schooling. And so Washington's education stops at a relatively low level for a gentleman of the period. Washington improves that, but he never acknowledges that. And because of that, he feels he comes across as a little simple, not very bright, and that makes him uncomfortable. But I think there's a shyness there too. I think he's not comfortable talking amongst people he doesn't know well, because you see a different Washington between the formal Washington and the public Washington and the Washington among strangers than you see when you read personal letters or you talk to close friends of Washington. So I do believe a lot of that is an insecurity, and probably an insecurity that he shouldn't have had.
Probably also being in the public eye so much probably didn't help either.
Well, particularly not when you are a private man.
Yes, I definitely could not be in that position. Amy wants to know, was there any historical precedent to the inauguration and the presidency? Like, we know that Washington's was the first one in our country's history, but what about elsewhere? Well,
there's coronations, how kings are made, and there's some similarity there. I don't doubt at all that that's part of what inspired the idea of an inauguration, which is another reason, I suppose, to accuse them of being monarchical.
And then Jacob wants to know, what traditions did Washington begin for the presidency?
I think the most obvious one probably is the body of counselors that surround the president. The president's cabinet is a creation, not all the offices in it. We had Secretary of War, but the idea of that cabinet and a bunch of counselors to guide the president, and even its name, the cabinet, all is a creation of Washington. It's not a portion of the Constitution. Beyond that, it's everything. If you go through and read the Constitution, it's only 6 pages long. It's very limited in what it actually states. It tells you what the government can do or what authority it's giving it, but not how that's going to happen. That's the importance of the beginning of the federal period, when we're putting all of it into motion. There's an awful lot of what we now do is decided by the actions they took rather than how they got there. What did they decide? How did they read it? What did they do? And there were challenges all the time. There's one that came really close to seeing Washington impeached. They threatened to. And that was when the Jay Treaty was being ratified. The Constitution gives the power of treaty to the president with consent and advice to the Senate. And the Congress was unhappy with the treaty. And they thought that there was some, because we got so little out of it, they thought there was behind the scenes wheeling and dealing between the presidency and the representatives in England. And so they wanted to see his correspondence regarding it. And Washington refused. Washington refused because it would create a precedent. And the Congress doesn't have the authority to see private documents of the presidency which can injure the security of the nation unless subpoenaed, which is basically what happened. As Washington said, if you impeach me and subpoena the documents, then I will share them with you. Otherwise, for the precedent of security, I'm not sharing them. And in the end, they weren't shared.
Right. John wants to know if there's any insight into what Mr. Washington's mother thought of him becoming president, other than proud, I'm sure.
I don't think there was much pride, actually. Washington's relationship with his mother is difficult. It's a challenging situation. And she often doesn't, she sees Washington's advancements as being more of an infringement on his duties to her. And she's not, actually, she's got a point. It is the responsibility of the eldest son in the 18th century to look after the mother. And surviving, well, in fact, even not surviving, Washington's older brothers were actually all half-brothers. He is Mary Ball Washington's oldest son, not only surviving. And he doesn't take that responsibility on. And he puts her under his sister to care for. So it's basically a twofold issue. Something I think is interesting, though, and worth pointing out, as cold and as awkward as their relationship seems to have been, when she died, she left absolutely everything she had to George. And when she was dying, when it was clear that that her days were numbered, she was suffering cancer, and she lived to be 80 something. She was advanced, particularly for an 18th century life. She's advanced in years, but during the presidency, early in the first term, is when that comes to its terminal end, and there comes a point where Washington knows from the letters that it's here, and there's nothing he can do now. He cannot. Travel is a lot harder, and the world is a much bigger place in the 18th century. There's no means by which he can get away from New York to get down there. And he writes a letter, and you can almost feel the tears in it when he's realizing that he's never going to see his mother again. So their relationship was cold, but I don't want you to think that there was no tenderness that you might expect still. There still was some mother and son connection there.
That is actually a really good point, because it's another layer of seeing the challenges that come not just with being in an office like president for the person who's in that office, but also for their family, the strain and the toll it takes. So it's a good way to think about it. We have just a couple more minutes left. And Ron, I just wanted to know if there were any thoughts you'd like to share on this Inauguration Day before we say goodbye.
Well, I want to mention and remind the country just how fortunate we are that we have this custom of peaceable transition, and that we have maintained it through many challenges and difficulties, through 245 years, that our Constitution, when it was created, these men, they viewed it as an experiment. They didn't know if people could govern themselves. And it's clearly in everything you see in the writings of the period, they understand that it may not survive, that it is going to be a challenge to survive it. There's a famous story that Franklin makes at the end of the Constitutional Convention, when he looks upon the star, the sun depicted on Washington's chair, and he says, is it a rising star, a rising sun, or a setting sun? When he was asked what form of government we created, he said, a republic, if you can keep it. We have kept it. Our systems of government, our Constitution, has survived numerous challenges, and it continues. And we only grow stronger from these successes.
I think that is perfectly said. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for today. So I want to thank you, Ron, for joining us. And,
thank you for having me.
Sharing such wonderful wisdom. I also want to thank all of you for watching and sending in your questions for us to ask. This is a very timely conversation in recognition of the new administration and our peaceful transfer of power, and hopefully many more to come. Additionally, I'd like to say a special thank you to all of our donors who, without their donations and their generous support, this program and many others would not be possible. It's only because of you that we can share the complete and engaging story of our nation. We're so glad you took the opportunity to join us today, and we hope you'll visit us soon here at Colonial Williamsburg. Have a great day.